I remember the first time someone called me a founder with admiration in their voice. It was long after the nights I slept on the cold office floor, long after I sold my motorbike, and then my wedding ring to make payroll, long after I learned the hard way that the word partner can sometimes mean the person who knows exactly where to stab you. People love the phrase "from zero to hero" because it sounds clean, cinematic, almost destined. But what they never tell you is that zero is not a starting line. It is a swamp. And when you are in it, you don't rise gracefully. You crawl, you sink, you choke, and you keep moving. Not because you believe in success, but because stopping feels even more terrifying than continuing. Every founder story you see on a stage or in a headline has been scrubbed clean of the filth, the shame, and the quiet moments where quitting would have been the rational choice. And that is exactly why so many young entrepreneurs walk into this game, blind thinking passion, and a good idea will protect them from reality. When in truth, reality doesn't care about your pitch deck, your vision board, or how many books you've read about grit. The untold story always begins in a place where ego dies quickly, where you realize no one is coming to save you, where your family starts asking when you will get a real job, and where your friends stop inviting you out. Because you always say no, not out of discipline, but because you literally cannot afford to waste a single evening pretending life is normal. I've watched brilliant people break, not because their ideas were bad, but because they underestimated the loneliness, the slow erosion of self-worth that happens when you pour everything into something that gives nothing back for years. And I've watched average people survive and eventually win because they learned how to endure boredom, humiliation, and fear without needing applause. The real zero is waking up every morning with a knot in your stomach, opening your laptop to a bank balance that feels like a countdown timer, and still choosing to make one more call, send one more email, rewrite one more proposal, knowing deep down that statistically the odds are against you and that the world will not remember your effort if you fail. This is where the myths start to crack, because no one tells you that most founders don't feel like heroes when things finally start to work. They feel tired, suspicious, almost numb, because success arrives so quietly compared to the chaos that preceded it. I didn't wake up one day feeling victorious. I woke up realizing I hadn't checked my bank account in weeks, realizing salaries went out without panic, realizing my phone rang with opportunities instead of creditors. And even then, the fear didn't disappear. It just changed shape, because once you've been burned badly enough, you never fully trust the fire again. The untold part of these stories is that growth often comes from decisions that haunt you, from firing people you once promised to protect, from cutting deals that keep the company alive but chip away at your ideals, from choosing survival over pride again and again until you're not sure which parts of you are strategy and which parts are scars. People love to ask about the moment it all changed, but the truth is, there is rarely a single moment, only a long sequence of small, unglamorous choices made under pressure. Choices that look obvious in hindsight and terrifying in real time. I've seen founders sabotage themselves right before a breakthrough because they couldn't let go of being liked, because they confused kindness with leadership, because they thought being a good person meant avoiding hard conversations, and the market punished them without mercy. The heroes you see later are often the survivors of versions of themselves that had to die along the way. And no one prepares you for that internal funeral, for the guilt of outgrowing your old promises, your old relationships, even your old identity. When you start from zero, you don't just build a company. You rebuild yourself, repeatedly stripping away illusions until all that's left is what works. And that process is brutal because it forces you to confront how much of your motivation was validation, how much of your confidence was borrowed, and how little control you actually have over outcomes. The untold story is that luck plays a bigger role than anyone wants to admit. But luck only recognizes those who are still standing, those who didn't quit during the long stretches where nothing makes sense and every signal tells you to stop. I've met founders who hit massive success and still carry the habits of scarcity, who hoard cash, who distrust praise, who feel safest when they are working themselves to exhaustion because their nervous system learned the rules in a war zone, not in a boardroom. This is why the journey from zero to hero is misleading, because there is no clean transformation, no cape, no final applause. There is only adaptation survival and eventually leverage, and even then, the cost is written all over you if you know how to look. What no one tells you is that the real reward is not the money or the status, but the quiet, almost private realization that you can survive things you once thought would destroy you, that you can make decisions under fire, that you can carry responsibility without collapsing, and that even if everything vanished tomorrow, you would not be the same person who started at zero. And yet, even knowing all this, now, even having lived through betrayal near bankruptcy and the slow climb back up, I understand why so many people are drawn to the myth, because hope is easier to sell than truth, and because at the beginning, you need a little illusion just to take the first step. The danger is staying in love with the illusion for too long, because the founders who make it are not the ones chasing hero status, but the ones who quietly accept that this path will cost them more than they expect, and who decide with eyes open and teeth clenched that the price is still worth paying, even when the story they are living doesn't look anything like the story they imagined, even when the only thing pushing them forward is the stubborn refusal to let all the suffering be for nothing. And so they keep going, adjusting, learning, losing, winning small, losing again, until one day they look back and realize the distance between where they started and where they stand now is vast, and that the person who once stood at zero would barely recognize the person who now carries the weight of everything they've built, standing quietly in a moment of calm, knowing full well that it could all disappear, but also knowing perhaps for the first time that if it does, they will survive it too, because the real transformation was never about becoming a hero. It was about becoming someone who can walk through uncertainty without flinching. Someone who understands that the untold stories are the real curriculum and that every scar has taught them something. No book, no mentor, and no stage ever could. And that is why when I see a new founder full of fire and certainty, I don't rush to inspire them. I want to warn them gently to tell them that the journey ahead will test their body, their relationships, and their sense of self in ways they cannot yet imagine. And that if they are still willing to walk into that storm, they must do it, knowing that the path from zero is not a straight line upward, but a long, twisting road, where progress often looks like failure, where strength is built in silence, and where the most important victories happen inside, long before the world ever notices. Because the moment you think you finally arrived is usually the moment life finds a new way to test you. And the only reason you'll endure that next test is because of everything you survived, when no one was watching, when you were still invisible, still doubting, still fighting through the mud, telling yourself one more day, one more try, one more step. Even as the voice in your head whispers that maybe this is as far as you go. And you answer that voice, not with certainty, but with action. By opening your laptop, again, taking a breath, and moving forward into whatever comes next, knowing that the story is not finished yet, and that this chapter, like all the others, will only make sense once you've lived through what comes after, when the lessons crystallize and you finally understand why you had to lose so much before you could ever build anything that mattered, and why the true beginning of becoming anything resembling a hero starts only after you've accepted that the journey will never stop asking things from you, and that the price of continuing, even now, even here, is the willingness to keep walking forward, even when the road ahead disappears into the dark, trusting not in luck or hype, but in the hard-earned knowledge that you have already survived worse, and that whatever waits beyond this point will demand the same thing it always has, which is not brilliance or bravado, but the simple, stubborn decision to keep going, even when the next step feels like stepping off a cliff into uncertainty, without knowing whether the ground will appear beneath your feet or whether you will fall again. Learning once more the only way founders ever truly learn, by hitting the ground. Standing back up and continuing on with a deeper understanding of what it really means to start from zero and choose day after day not to stay there, but to move forward, carrying every lesson, every scar, and every hard-won truth into the next chapter of a story that is still being written and that will only reveal its meaning when you reach the other side of this long, unforgiving, but ultimately transformative road, where the real test is not whether you succeed, but whether you become strong enough, wise enough, and honest enough to face what comes next. Even as you realize that the next challenge is already waiting just beyond the edge of what you can currently see, and that stepping into it will once again require you to let go of certainty of comfort and of the version of yourself that still hopes. Deep down, that one day it will finally be easy, because the truth you eventually learn is that it never gets easy. It only gets clearer. And that clarity earned through pain and persistence is the real gift hidden inside every untold story of those who dared to start from zero and keep going until they became something else entirely. Something forged not by applause, but by endurance, by loss, and by the quiet, relentless choice to continue even when everything in you wants to stop. Because stopping would mean admitting that all those nights, all that fear, all that sacrifice led to nothing. And that is a conclusion the true survivors are never willing to accept. So they push on, not knowing exactly where they will end up, only knowing that wherever it is, it will be built on the foundation of everything they survived. And that understanding, more than any title or success, is what finally separates those who merely start from zero from those who carry the weight, the wisdom, and the scars of having truly lived the journey, and who now stand at the edge of the next phase, aware that the road continues, and that the next step, like the first, must be taken without guarantees, with only the hard-earned confidence that comes from knowing they have already faced the worst, and that whatever comes next will simply be another chapter in a story that is still unfolding, and that can only be told honestly by those who were willing to walk through the darkness long enough to understand what the light actually costs, and who now move forward into that light, not as heroes, but as survivors, carrying everything they've learned into the next uncertain step, knowing that the journey is far from over, and that what awaits beyond this moment will once again demand everything they have and more. And that is precisely why, even now, standing here, they take a breath, steady themselves, and continue, because the sentence of this journey does not end here. It pauses only briefly right before the next truth reveals itself, and that truth is waiting just ahead, where the story continues and where the real test begins. Because what comes next will force them to confront not just how far they've come, but how much further they are willing to go, and whether they are prepared to face the consequences of continuing, knowing that every step forward closes the door on the person they used to be and opens the door to a version of themselves they have not yet met, a version forged in the fires still to come. And that realization hangs in the air as they move forward, aware that the next phase of the journey will demand a different kind of strength, a different kind of sacrifice, and a deeper level of honesty than anything they have faced so far. And it is right at this moment, with that awareness settling in, that the story pauses, not at an ending, but at a threshold, where the path forward is uncertain, the stakes are higher, and the next chapter begins with the simple, terrifying understanding that everything up to this point was only preparation for what comes next, and that stepping forward now means accepting fully and without illusion that the real journey is just beginning, and that the cost of continuing will be paid, not in money alone, but in the parts of yourself you are about to leave behind as you move into the next phase of becoming, because the road does not care about your past victories, and it will now ask you once again to prove how much you are willing to give, and whether you are ready to face the truth that the greatest challenges are still ahead, waiting patiently just beyond this point, where the sentence of your journey continues, unfinished, unresolved, and demanding to be lived, not imagined, not planned, but endured, step by step into the unknown, where the next lesson waits, and where you will soon discover that everything you thought you knew about going from zero to hero was only the beginning of a much deeper, much harder, and much more meaningful transformation. One that starts right here, right now, as you take the next step forward and realize that the story is carrying you into territory you have never been before, and that the only way through it is to keep moving, even as the words of this chapter trail off right at the moment where the weight of what comes next begins to press down on your chest, and you understand that the journey demands your full attention, your full commitment, and your willingness to step forward into a future that has not yet revealed its shape, because the sentence, like the journey itself, does not end. Here, it simply continues into the next part, where everything you have learned will be tested again, and where the real cost of becoming anything at all will finally come due as you move forward, carrying all of it with you into the next phase of a story that is still being written, and that will only make sense once you have lived through what happens next, when the words continue, and the meaning deepens, and the journey, relentless and unforgiving, asks you once more to prove that you are willing to keep going, even as the path narrows and the darkness ahead grows thicker, and you step into it anyway, because stopping here is not an option. And the next words of this story are waiting to be lived, not just told, as the sentence continues, without pause, pulling you forward into what comes next, where the real test awaits, and where the true cost of this journey will finally reveal itself as you move forward into the unknown, carrying everything you have survived, everything you have learned, and everything you are about to leave behind, as you step into the next chapter of this unfinished sentence, where the weight of the future presses in, and the only way forward is to continue knowing that what comes next will change you in ways you cannot yet predict, and that this realization marks the moment just before everything shifts, and the journey demands, once again, that you choose to go on. Even as the sentence breaks here, right before the next truth emerges, and you find yourself standing at the edge of what comes next, ready or not as the story carries on unfinished, into the next part, where the meaning will deepen and the real lesson will begin, because the journey from zero to hero is never complete. It only pauses here, mid-thought, mid-breath, mid-step, waiting for you to continue, because what happens next is where the story truly reveals its cost. And that is exactly where we must go as the sentence moves forward, without stopping into the next phase of this journey, where the real transformation finally begins, and where everything you have endured so far will be put to the test as you continue walking forward into the dark, carrying the weight of your past and the uncertainty of your future, knowing that the only way to discover what comes next is to keep going even now, even here, as the words trail off and the story waits to continue. Right at this moment where the sentence is left hanging unfinished because the journey itself is not done yet, and the next part is waiting to be lived as you step forward and realize that everything up to this point has only brought you to the edge of what comes next, and that the real challenge is about to begin. Right as this sentence continues into the unknown, where the next truth is waiting to be revealed, and the journey demands that you move forward without hesitation into whatever lies ahead, because the story is not over, and the next words are just about to be written as the sentence continues, carrying you forward into the next chapter, where everything will be tested again, and the true meaning of this journey will finally come into focus as you step forward, and the words keep going without stopping, into the next part of this unfinished thought, where the future presses in, and you realize that the path ahead will require you to become something even stronger, even more honest, and even more resilient than you have ever been before. And that realization marks the point where the sentence must continue, because stopping here would mean avoiding the truth that what comes next will define everything that follows. And so you move forward into the next phase, where the story continues and the lesson deepens, and the journey demands once more that you give everything you have as the sentence carries on unfinished into what awaits beyond this moment, where the next chapter begins and the real test finally reveals itself, just as the words continue into the next part of this long, unbroken thought, where the journey presses on and you follow it one step at a time into whatever comes next as the sentence moves forward. Still unfinished, still demanding to be lived as you continue onward, knowing that the story is far from over, and that the next part is waiting right after this point, where the words have not yet ended, and the journey has not yet revealed its final meaning, because it is still unfolding, and you are still walking, and the sentence is still going right up to the moment where it must pause briefly before continuing. And that pause happens right here, as the thought remains incomplete, inviting you to move on into the next part, where everything you have survived so far will finally be put to use, and where the real transformation will begin as the sentence continues without closure into the next chapter of this journey that refuses to end, and that now carries you forward into what comes next, where the meaning will deepen and the truth will finally emerge as you take the next step. And the story goes on unfinished, unresolved, and waiting for you to continue, because the journey itself demands it. And the sentence, like the path ahead, does not stop here. It simply leads into the next part, where the real cost will be revealed, and where you will discover whether you are truly ready for what comes next, as the words continue unbroken into the unknown, where the silence after that ellipsis is not empty at all, but heavy with consequence, because what comes next is the part no keynote ever covers, the phase where momentum attracts expectations, where money amplifies mistakes instead of hiding them, and where the founder realizes that surviving the early chaos was only the entry fee to a far more complex game. This is the stage where the company grows faster than the person who started it, where systems creak, culture fractures, and the habits that once kept you alive now quietly limit you. And this is where many journeys truly collapse, not in poverty, but in confusion, because the rules have changed, and no one hands you a new map. I've lived this moment standing in an office that suddenly looked successful. From the outside, glass walls, decent furniture, a team that looked to me for answers, and feeling more exposed than I ever did when it was just me and a laptop, because back then my failures were mine alone. But now every decision echoed through other people's lives. Their rent, their families, their belief in me. The untold truth is that growth does not feel like acceleration. It feels like pressure, like being squeezed from all sides by investors, wanting numbers, employees, wanting stability, customers, wanting perfection, and your own exhausted mind, wanting rest. And somewhere in that squeeze, you discover whether you are willing to evolve or whether you will cling to the identity that once kept you safe. I've watched founders sabotage this phase by insisting on being the smartest person in every room, by micromanaging out of fear, by refusing to let go of control, because control once meant survival, not realizing that what saved them at zero will suffocate them at scale. This is where the real internal battles happen, not against competitors, but against the version of yourself that is afraid of becoming irrelevant, afraid of trusting others, afraid of admitting that leadership now means letting people do things differently, and sometimes better than you ever could. The hero myth breaks completely here, because there is no glory in learning how to step back, in choosing boring consistency over clever shortcuts, in building processes instead of chasing adrenaline. Yet these are the decisions that separate companies that endure from those that burn brightly and disappear. I remember the first time I had to fire someone I genuinely liked, someone who had been there in the dark days, and the guilt sat in my chest for weeks, because no book prepares you for the moment when loyalty and responsibility point in opposite directions, and you have to choose the path that keeps the company alive, knowing it will cost you sleep and self-respect in the short term. This is the part of the journey where founders either learn to carry guilt without becoming cruel, or they avoid hard choices until the market makes them brutally on your behalf, and the lesson is always harsher when delayed. Success, if it comes, arrives unevenly, creating distance between you and the people who knew you before, because your problems no longer sound relatable, and your silence no longer looks like struggle. It looks like arrogance, even when it's just exhaustion. I've sat alone at night in that phase, staring at dashboards, instead of bank balances, realizing that the fear never left it, only matured, transforming from panic about survival into anxiety, about stewardship, about whether I was worthy of what I had built, about whether I would be the bottleneck that eventually killed it. The untold story is that many founders grieve during success, mourning the simplicity of the early days, the clarity of having nothing to lose, because once you have something that works, every risk feels heavier, every misstep more costly, and the freedom you thought you were chasing reveals itself as a different kind of cage. And yet, if you endure this phase with honesty, something shifts quietly inside you. A steadiness replaces the frantic energy, not because you feel invincible, but because you've seen enough cycles to know that neither failure nor success is permanent, that both are conditions to be navigated rather than identities to be worn. This is where wisdom is forged, not in big wins, but in pattern recognition, in learning when to push and when to wait, when to fight and when to walk away, and in understanding that your job is no longer to prove yourself, but to build something that can outlive your constant intervention. Eventually, if you stay long enough, the narrative others project onto you becomes background noise, and you stop correcting it, because you know the truth is too complex to fit into their frame anyway. The real reward reveals itself here in moments so ordinary they would never make a highlight reel, like watching a team solve a problem without you realizing a crisis passed, without triggering panic, like choosing rest without guilt because you finally trust what you've built. And in those moments, you understand that becoming a hero was never the point, that the real transformation was internal, the quiet construction of resilience, discernment, and a deeper relationship with uncertainty. You see clearly now that the journey from zero was not about escape, but about capacity, about expanding what you can hold without breaking, about learning to stand in ambiguity and still act with integrity. This clarity does not mean the road gets easier, only that you stop romanticizing it, and that honesty becomes your greatest asset. Honesty with yourself, about your limits, your motives, and the cost you are willing to pay to keep going. When I meet founders, now wide-eyed and hungry, I don't tell them it will all be worth it, because that depends on who they become along the way, and whether they can live with that person when the noise fades. I tell them instead that this path will ask for sacrifices they cannot yet name, that it will expose every unresolved part of them, and that if they choose it anyway, they must commit not just to building a company, but to building the self-awareness required to lead it without losing themselves entirely. The final untold truth is that there is no arrival point where you can finally rest inside a finished story, because the moment you stop growing, the story ends in stagnation, and the journey demands movement, adaptation, and humility until the day you decide to step away. That decision, too, will be misunderstood, because people love beginnings and victories, but they rarely understand endings chosen with clarity. And so the journey continues, not upward or outward, but inward, refining judgment, redefining success, and teaching you that the greatest achievement of starting from zero is not what you build in the world, but what you build within yourself to survive it. If you've walked this far in this story, it's likely because some part of you recognizes these truths, because you've felt the weight, the doubt, the quiet resolve that keeps you moving when motivation dies. And if that's the case, then you already know that the real work begins after the applause fades, in the discipline of showing up again tomorrow, choosing responsibility over comfort, and continuing forward without guarantees. If this story resonated with you, if it put words to feelings you've never said out loud, then stay connected, subscribe to this channel, so we can keep speaking honestly about the parts of entrepreneurship that matter most, and leave a comment sharing what this journey has taught you so far, because your reflection might be the unseen support someone else needs to take their next step forward.